Welcome to The Real News. This is Bill Fletcher. Thanks for joining us. The Russo-Ukrainian War, or more precisely, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, has brought forward some interesting and peculiar schisms within the left and progressive movements in the Western world, including but not limited to the United States. Today, the Real News Network has the opportunity to interview two Ukrainian activists and one Russian activist regarding the conflict and its ramifications. All too often, certainly in the United States, there's been a tendency by some progressives to almost dictate what they believe to be the terms upon which the Russo-Ukrainian War should be settled. Our objective in this broadcast is to hear the voices of people from Russia and Ukraine. We're honored to have with us today the following guests: Yuliya Yurchenko, Alona Lacheva, and Ilya Budrekis. Yuliya is a senior lecturer and researcher in political economy at the Political Economy, Governance, Finance, and Accountability Institute and the Economics and International Business Department, the University of Greenwich in the UK. She's the author of Ukraine and the Empire of Capital, From Marketisation to Armed Conflict, and many other publications, including in Capital and Class and New Political Economy. She is vice chair of the Critical Political Economy Research Network Board of the European Sociological Association, co-coordinator of the World Economy Working Group, IIPPE, and editor for Capital and Class. Alona is a PhD candidate in urban studies at the University of Milan Bicocca, focusing on housing in Eastern Europe. She is a co-editor of Commons, a journal for social criticism. Ilya writes regularly on politics, art, film, and philosophy for Eflux Journal, Open Democracy, Lefties, Cultura.ru, and other outlets, and teaches at the Moscow School of Social and Economic Sciences and the Institute of Contemporary Art, Moscow. The Russian edition of his essay collection, Dissidents Among Dissidents, was awarded the prestigious Andrei Bely Prize in 2017. Guests, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I want to begin with a question for all of you to answer, and it is, what are the latest developments in the war? Help us understand what is happening right now, what are the conditions like in both of your countries, and how has this impacted political consciousness? So let's just start with, very briefly, what's your assessment of the current situation? And I'd like to start with Yuliya, if you could take a crack at that, and then we'll just go through everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us here and facilitating this crucial discussion that is getting more urgent by the day. The situation in Ukraine is both desperate and also defiant, if you like. Not defiant, excuse me. Heroic in some sense. So in the recent days, Russia has ramped up its attacks on civilian infrastructure, on its occupied territories, and on the cities of Ukraine that have seen sporadic attacks lately. Russia's been using swarms of Iranian drones to terrorize civilians in cities such as Kyiv, perhaps, and that has caught a lot of international news, but also a lot of other major cities. And one of the examples is Zhytomyr, for example, a couple of days ago, that's without water and electricity, as are many other cities. 30% of energy infrastructure of the country is destroyed by now. A lot of water utilities and supply systems are damaged. And it is a very clear message to Ukraine that comes from Russian TV channels, Russian politicians, and military mouthpieces, and is evident in Russian action that Russia wants Ukrainians to freeze to death this winter. If bombing didn't push them into submission, then hunger, lack of sanitary conditions, and lack of heat will. This is a full-on scale genocidal war. Ukrainians are resisting. Ukrainian spirit is still upbeat despite all of this horror. But of course, we have to understand that spirit alone and solidarity alone and the networks that Ukrainians have been building for over 8 years now, of course, will not be sufficient to withstand this terrorism without adequate support from partners from abroad, including United States, of course. And we're talking here as military and humanitarian support, of course, and diplomatic pressure on Russia to stop terrorizing Ukraine, stop its genocidal invasion, withdraw the troops, and allow for legitimate authorities to take control over the annexed territories, illegally annexed territories, and provide adequate help to both to occupied people and, of course, also return those who have been captured and kidnapped and sent to Russia, including hundreds of thousands of children who have been stolen from Ukraine. Some are saying that Russia is deserting to these kind of actions as an act of last resort, if you like, and they are organizing because they're running out of supplies and the morale of their troops is low, which is undeniable to some extent. But at the same time, we should not be underestimating the severity of the situation, nor should we expecting for it to be over within the coming days.
Alona, do you wish to add anything to what Yuliya just said?
Yeah, I completely agree with Yuliya's analysis of situation in among the civilian population. Moreover, I'm based in Lviv and my family is in Kiev now, so I'm experiencing, electricity cuts and absence of internet when I cannot, text my mother. But at the same time, I wanted to add on the situation on the front line, because in the last weeks, we're clearly seeing how Ukrainian army took leadership in this war, how the counterattack of Ukrainian forces is being successful. And we're not only talking about this media examples of Crimean Bridge, but we're talking about liberation of Kharkiv Oblast. We're talking about liberation of parts of Kherson and Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. And now one of the main, questions on the front line is if Kherson, the city of Kherson, will be liberated. And it looks like that Ukrainian side has all the chances to do it. But at the same time, we need to remember that news about successes of Ukrainian army after this amazing and happy news about liberation of some regions, come news about war crimes committed by Russian soldiers, and also come news about deaths of our soldiers who are taking part in these operations. But this is something which probably sometimes comes out of the picture when we're seeing this amazing news about successes of Ukrainian army.
Thank you. Yuliya, how does this look from within Russia?
So first of all, as many other Russian activists, the people who were active politically during recent years, I am currently not in Russia. I left the country in early March after the start of the war and after the turn of the Russian political regime into an open semi-fascist dictatorship, as I think, for instance. But of course, I'm following the situation. I have a lot of contacts with people who are opposing the war and who are still in the country. And in fact, we had some fresh news from today because President Putin just a couple of hours ago made announcement of some kind of martial law implemented in the country, which means that Russia is logically going to the to its failure of this military operation, and this failure related with the escalation of the war from the Russian side. Yuliya already told about the bombardment of the Ukrainian infrastructure. And the successes of Ukrainian army. Now you have the city of Kherson, which will be probably liberated by Ukrainian army in some coming weeks. So in order to prevent this failure, and in order to prevent the crisis of his own regime, Putin wants to somehow involved as much as possible the population of the whole country, the population of Russia, into this criminal war. From the late September, we had so-called mobilization, or so-called partial mobilization. In fact, hundreds of thousands people were mobilized to Russian army by force. Many of them were sent already to Ukraine, and many of them already died in the front line because they were completely unprepared. There was not enough training, enough weapons, and so on for them to be in this war. Of course, this mobilization was not very well welcomed, like in Russian society. During the last 4 weeks, you have a very massive run out of the country. So from the late September, more than 400,000 people, mostly men, left the country. And of course, you have much more people who are trying to escape from the army, from the mobilization in the different ways. Also, you have a growing spontaneous resistance in the country from the beginning of mobilization. Some more than 30 military officers in the different parts of the country were burned. Also, you had a number of spontaneous protests, and I think that this mobilization was a very big mistake for President Putin and create a very serious challenge for his regime in the foreseeable future.
You know, I'm almost embarrassed to ask this question, but 8 months into this war, there still remains a debate certainly in the U.S., and I've sensed in other parts of the West, about the origins of the war. And you hear from some people that this war would never have started had it not been for NATO expansion. And I'm curious, from the standpoint of the three of you, how do you look at what are the actual origins of this? Who's at fault? And where, if anywhere, does NATO fall into this whole equation? And Alana, I'd like to start with you on this.
Mm-hmm. I have heard this question so many times, and sorry, but it's almost a joke for me, because Ukraine is a sovereign state, and there is only one imperialist army on its territory, and it is Russian army. There are no NATO soldiers. We are receiving, and not in the amount and not in the needed speed, the weapons from members of NATO, but not from the NATO itself. So this question honestly sounds like a joke from a Ukrainian perspective, because for us, it's rather we're critical of NATO, not because it somehow influenced start of the war, but because now some NATO countries are not sure if they are ready to help Ukraine. And clearly there is, was a strong underestimation of Russian imperialism among international community, because yes, Russian imperialism and Putin's power ambitions are the key reason why this war started and why it goes on even when Russian forces fail to achieve what they wanted. Moreover, for many Ukrainians, NATO is not even a thing. Like, I'm a sociologist, and we continue to interview people now, and we also ask them questions about what do you think, how this war started. And many of my respondents, they do not even know what NATO is. Yeah, I would say that it's the reason why people ask this question, because they do not perceive Ukraine as a sovereign state. They do not perceive Ukrainians as people who have a right for self-defense. And I would say that this geopolitical framework is wrong in its very beginning. But I'm really happy that you ask, the question in this way. You ask Ukrainians about what actually goes on. Yeah. Thanks.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's sort of amazing to me when I hear people in the United States make these arguments, but they keep coming up. And Yuliya, I'm just curious whether you want to add anything to this. And Ilya, would like to hear from you on this.
Thank you. I want to second Alena's sentiment about this. It's I was smiling as you asked this question as well, and of course this is no laughing matter. But I'm a political economist, and we're always told that we need to think, we need to ask ourselves this question: cui bono? Yeah. But as we have also seen with the anti-vaxxers arguments, cui bono does not always have the answer. Just because pharmaceutical companies produce vaccines, it doesn't mean that they have produced the virus to kill people. Similar thing we can say about the spread of NATO. Do arms producers benefit from wars? Certainly. Who else would possibly be? Maybe not milk producers. But it doesn't mean that they are behind manufacturing this conflict. Another thing that we need to understand is that when certain people threaten to kill you and turn your country into nuclear dust, and that's a quote from quite a few by now Russian politicians, you probably need to believe them. Let's just look at Putin's speeches and their evolution over the years. And also the discourse and certain narratives that dominate Russian state TV and also Russian parliamentarians. It is very loud and clear that they do not recognize Ukraine as a subject in its own right. By now, it's outright genocidal rhetoric. And we're still wondering whether NATO is an issue or not. Somehow, we keep forgetting that the Baltic countries, for example, have joined NATO, and they are kind of closer to Russia than all that in terms of territory. By now, also Finland and a number of other countries are talking about expedited membership in NATO. And there is a running joke in Eastern Europe that Russia and Putin, specifically Putin's regime, because Putin's regime doesn't equal Russia, are the biggest recruitment agents for NATO. And NATO doesn't even figure half the time anymore in Putin's rhetoric. As unhinged and is made sound to us, we need to pay attention to what they're saying. If anything, the launch of the full-scale invasion, and we need to remember that Putin's regime invaded Ukraine with annexation of Crimea in the beginning of 2014. They, in that period, by having invaded Ukraine, they have actually put a wedge between Ukraine and its potential NATO membership, but also have boosted support for NATO in Ukraine, which most Ukrainians didn't support in 2013. So I think very often it is a bit of a straw man on the international left, quote unquote, because it's not a homogeneous group, of course, but on the international left, amongst those from who we hear this argument, I think there is still kind of some sort of denial of reality that Cold War is over and USSR doesn't exist anymore, and Russian Federation isn't USSR, nor is it an ideological counterweight to United States imperialism. Also, all of these narratives about how Ukrainian workers and Russian workers shall rise against their oligarchic regimes are absolutely divorced from reality. Under which conditions, in the middle of genocidal war, is this going to happen? Would I want to see that happen? Absolutely. Is this going to happen now while actually Ukrainian workers and Russian workers are killing each other, some with genocidal intent and some trying to protect their homes? It's probably not likely to happen. So I think we need to, when we try to make any analysis, and again, I'm going to invoke my political economy training, we need to work with the material reality in which we're trying to derive and discursive reality from which we're trying to derive conclusions. And that reality is that is a neo-colonial war of conquest with a genocidal intent where Putin wants to have Ukraine to Russian Federation to exploitation because he's hell-bent of also having the access to the Black Sea ports, amongst other things. And if he can't have Ukraine with Ukrainians, he'll have it without. And that's the end of it, I think.
Yuliya, I want to just follow up on that. And then I'd like to ask Ilya the same question, or earlier question. You've mentioned genocide a couple of times and genocidal intent on the part of the Putin regime. Many people use those terms and they throw them around loosely. I'm not accusing you of doing that. Tell us why you use that term. What is it about what is going on that has led you to that conclusion?
Well, there are plenty of reports published already, and I encourage reviewers to take a look at the Kharkiv Human Rights Group, for example. They've done a couple of very consistent reports, including the UN missions as well. There is an international consensus now that it is a genocidal war. One of deliberate intent to target an ethnic group on the basis of ethnic group, theft of children and forced educating them into Russian, burning Ukrainian books and filtration camps in occupied territories on the basis of how Ukrainian you are. All of those are examples of Russia committing crimes of genocide. There are international human rights lawyers and genocide and those who specialize in genocidal convention who actually have produced consistent reports in this. I think Alona can also say a couple of words to that to this specific point.
I wanted to share preliminary outcomes of the research I'm conducting now on de-occupied territories. I collect interviews with people who survived occupation in Kiev region, and my colleagues collect interviews with people who survived occupation in Kharkiv region. And we talk to people who went through torture and, all these interrogations by Russian army. And from what we hear is that people were tortured or not, killed or not, on the basis on if they consider themselves Ukrainians. They were interrogated and tortured with the question, is Ukraine a state? Is Ukrainian language a language? And so on. And it just one of the many examples that this war has, an aim to target civilians based on who they are. And we not taking into account all the multiple war crimes, like not letting people escape from the occupied regions, like bombing of civilian infrastructure and civilians, and so on, so on.
Thank you.
If I could jump right in just for a second, there are 5 conditions in the Article 2 of the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of Crime of Genocide that also differentiated from any other war crimes. Those are crimes that are committed against a specific national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups that constitute 1, first condition, killing members of the group, box ticked. 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, torture, mental and physical, overwhelming evidence, including corroborated by Russians themselves. 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Just look at the shelling of the cities and look at what's going on in occupied areas. 4, imposing measures intended to prevent bursts within the group. Multiple evidence of men being castrated and women being raped to the point where, quote unquote, you will never want to birth Ukrainian children anymore. Those were the lines that were told to them by those who were mass raping them. And last but not least, forcibly transferring children of one group to another group. All of that, again, confirmed by international observers, confirmed by Ukrainian party and Russians themselves. They produce videos on their TV where they show how these children in thousands, in hundreds of thousands, stolen from Ukraine, are being put for adoption, even if they still have their parents alive, into Russian families to be turned into those who love Russia. So it's just at this point, the evidence is overwhelming.
Good. Yuliya, I want to return to the question of the origins of this war and actually ask you a couple of things. One, from your analysis, what you see as the origins, but there's this other thing that you mentioned in describing the Putin regime as semi-fascist. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, as well as how you see the origins of the Russian aggression.
I'm pretty agree with all that was said about the very imperialist origins of this war from the side of Russia, and even the very imperialist way of explanation, the very imperialist narrative that came directly from Putin's speeches. So if you follow his first speech just before the invasion, he named the main reason of the invasion. And this reason was that he believed that this is the historical lands belonged to the Russian Empire. So that was very clear. So the NATO argument, of course, it is still there, but I will say that now Putin is much more open about his gains and doesn't want to convince anyone inside Russia so much about the possible Ukrainian membership in NATO as the main reason for this war. So I think that that is a pure imperialist war from the Russian side, and it is important to understand this imperialism not only in terms of, let's say, economic interests because, of course, the war is already disastrous not only for Ukraine but for Russian economy as well. And the territories that are occupied by Russia, they are destroyed. So you have a city of Mariupol, which played a significant role in the economy of Ukraine, which is now in ruins. So you can say that you have some rational economic interest behind it. But I believe that there is another element in the imperialist politics, is the element of territorial control. So, for example, I don't believe that American invasion to Iraq was just about the oil. It was about the political and territorial control in this part of the world. So that is the aim of Putin, which could be understood by the American anti-imperialists because they have this kind of experience in their own recent history. But I also believe that there were not only external but also internal reasons for Putin's regime to launch this war. And of course, it was related with the growing politicization, which we can see during the last, let's say, 10 years in different forms in Russia. So it was the answer to the ongoing crisis of his own political system. And if we look at all the record of the Russian special military operations during the Putin's era, like 2008 in Georgia, especially 2014 in Ukraine with the annexation of Crimea and military involvement of Russia in Donbass. All these operations, all these military invasions played an important role to prevent the growing opposition to the regime. So in this way, the start of this war this year for Putin was the moment to start also a fully, fascist move of this regime from the top. So just in a week after the start of this invasion, all the independent media were destroyed. All the political groups which were still existed, opposition political groups were crushed. A number of new draconian laws were implemented, and I want to remind that from the start of this war, about 20,000 people were convinced for the so-called discreditation of the Russian army and distribution of the fake information about the so-called special military operation. So, of course, that is exact reason for this war to eliminate any sort of opposition in the country. And if before this invasion you can say in some way that Russia was a kind of authoritarian electoral something, that it was not a full scale dictatorship. Now you can say that this turn happened, and this turn happened exactly after the 24th of February.
Alona and Yuliya, speaking of fascism, what has often been raised is actually two things within Ukraine. One is there are constant references to fascists and the military fascists that were involved in the Maidan uprising and events. So one issue is, how significant is the far right within Ukraine. And the second issue is somewhat different, which is that it appears during this war that there have been moves by the Ukrainian government that have been repressive against workers, against sections of the left, neoliberal economic efforts that have been undertaken. How do we interpret that? So there's two questions. One is about to what extent is there a particular danger of the far right within Ukraine? And the second is about the question of what is happening under the auspices of the Zelensky government. Alana?
Yeah, probably I will talk more about the political part of this question because I'm not an economist, at least not at the moment. It's also, like an important part of Russian propaganda and justification of the invasion that they tried to, at least in the beginning of the invasion, of the full-scale invasion, there was a lot of talks about denazification. And talking about Ukrainian far right before the 24th and after, yes, there is such a force in like a political subject in Ukrainian politics as far right, but it's 100% less significant than in Poland, Hungary, France, US, of course. They did not manage, any of the far right parties did not manage to enter the parliament. They were mostly active in like small street demonstrations. Yes, they did more work on this like street politics level, but they were not a significant subject in Ukrainian politics. And for sure, it is, even if they were more like prominent, even if they had a huge party in parliament, it is a matter for Ukrainians to solve its issue with far right. That's one thing. But what is also, and I think there is an important change now. Of course, there are, in this popular resistance to the Russian imperialism, there are some parts which are far right, but they are just a small part of this whole resistance, because a lot of people who decided to join the army, they, justify why they want to fight Russia with like Soviet anti-fascist rhetorics of like fighting Hitler Germany. And everyone who, joins Ukrainian resistance has his or her own explanation why I do this. And of course, after the victory, we will need to talk between ourselves. Okay, what kind of country do we want to have? What kind of politics and like social structures do we want to have? But it's, of course, the question Ukrainians have to answer. And now we're just fighting for the right to be free to decide for ourselves what kind of politics we want to have. And being part of these huge mainstream far-right organizations, they need to, calm down their far-right rhetorics. And if you take a look what kind of people are now liberated as parts of Azov Battalion, these people joined Azov Battalion on the 24th of February because it was just like a media, battalion, and they wanted to defend their country, and they were like, okay, Azov, I go there. But they're even speaking Russian as their everyday language. And this is interesting to see how with this popular resistance, the far right needs to move closer to the center, because otherwise they will not be supported by the popular resistance. And yes, we do not know what's going to happen after the victory, but now we do not even have this freedom to decide what kind of country and politics we want to have. And now the main aim is to be free from the Russian occupation, and then we will talk about far left, far right. We will fight between ourselves without weapons, of course, but we are like getting ready for like huge political discussions about, all the possible questions. But Russia took the freedom for us to decide what kind of political spectrum we can have.
Thank you. Yuliya, on those two questions.
Yes, thank you. I second Alona in this conversation. Well, first of all, I think one thing is one important moment, one important point of clarification that needs to be made about Azov, because we hear about Azov all the time, is that, well, it was a volunteer battalion, and well, there are still people who volunteer to go to the army, but it were a lot of different battalions of volunteers who formed 8.5 years ago when the first invasion happened. And some of them, there were valid arguments about some of them were being not as much potentially under the control of the Ukrainian army and the rest of it. Well, that is clear. That is no more the case. It hasn't been for years. They're integral part of Ukrainian armed forces, subject to direct command of the Ministry of Defense. So we are talking about a part of Ukrainian army. To name me one army in the world that doesn't have some people in it that are right wing. That's where they go. Everybody, even in the peacetime, is a bit more patriotic, nationalistic, whatever you call it. That is their career choice. They love that kind of thing. So looking for right-wingers in the army is, looking for grain in silos. It's an absolutely normal phenomenon everywhere in the world. There was this whole also narrative about the right-wing coup in Ukraine. Well, there wasn't one. There was almost one in the US quite recently, but there wasn't one in Ukraine. And none of those people have, as Alona already mentioned, made any significant. They didn't have any political significance. What we need to remember that when Ukraine was in the middle of a war in 2014, no right-wing party gathered enough votes to get into the parliament. Alona already mentioned, but it's important to understand that Russia invaded Ukraine, and even at that point in history, nationalists didn't manage to get into the parliament. So if Ukraine is a country that with that kind of record has a problem with far right, then I think that I do not know which country doesn't. Look at what's happened in the recent French election. Look at what kind of coalition has won in Italy just now. I think we should stop trying to apply some sort of political purity tests to a country that is being invaded on the premise of it not being a nation. There will be some reactionary nationalist sentiment, and it would be strange if there wasn't. But when Poroshenko was going into an election in 2019 with nationalistic slogans, he was rejected. Nobody wanted that around. So we need to understand it. We have seen now through this war that the state of political discourse in Ukraine is that whoever is Ukrainian and calls this country their own and fights for it and wants to work for it, that is the definition of Ukrainian. We've seen a serious forging of Ukrainian as a civic identity. How it will all play out once the war is over, it's for us to see. I'm not in the business of making predictions for the future, especially in such a dynamic, for a lack of a better word, situation. But I think these kind of narratives about there being some nationalistically motivated people in a war, in a genocidal war, when their nationhood and ethnic identity is being denied as real, is simply unrealistic. In terms of the kind of anti-labor laws and generally kind of anti-social reforms that the government is pushing to some extent. So there are a couple of dimensions here. I'm going to try to be brief. First, wartime economy. We need to understand that we cannot judge Ukraine by the same token that we can judge any other country that's in the peacetime. There will be certain radical measures being adopted by the government. Whether they will remain in place after the war is over, it's a separate matter. I suspect that some of them will, because we have serious neoliberals in charge, who we also need to remember their ratings were going through the floor before the war has started. Then, and these kind of like anti-social, if you like, legislation that has been adopted, it has less to do with the fact that the government is nationalistic and more with the fact that they're neoliberal. It's a perfectly standard position of any politician who is obsessed with small state and big market to make assault on the rights of citizens, individuals, especially workers, and tilt the benefit towards the interest of capital at expense of the workers. This is a battle that we will be fighting without weapons after the war is over. And I think the price that Ukrainians are paying to have that civic dialogue and class struggle, to use the language that's more familiar to me, is very high. And in that sense, I'm hopeful, because Ukrainians, the revolution that was stolen from them by Russian invasion in 2014, that local oligarchs have managed to utilize, instrumentalize to remain in power, because none of them protesters wanted to stay in power in 2014. And they managed to twist this invasion to say, we need people with experience in charge up until the war is over. The war is in its 8.5 year, it's in the second half of its ninth year. And once it's over, that class conflict that was in the streets of Kyiv and Vinnytsia and Donetsk and Lugansk and Odessa and Sevastopol in 2014 and 2013, that will have to be reckoned with. And those in power, whichever party they belong to, whoever will remain in power, will have to build a fairer society and a fairer state and give more rights to the people, because Ukrainians will not put up with being taken for an economic ride anymore.
Thank you. Yuliya, I wanted to ask, in terms of what's going on in Russia, I mean, we've been seeing in the mainstream media about people trying to leave, men particularly, who were being called up. But I actually wanted to start in a different place. And in some ways, it flows from your discussion about the nature of the Putin regime. To what extent is there a mass base for the Putin regime or mass movements? And also, to what extent has there been broader opposition to both the regime and the war? How do we understand the internal situation in Russia?
It's a very good question about the social base of the regime, because if we come back to this fascist issue, as we know, the fascist movement from before, they were movements rising from below. But in the case of today, not just in Russia, but I think in some potentiality of many other countries with this far right turn, including US, we can see how this shift could be moved from the top, could be moved without kind of mass grassroots movement. So Putin regime started 22 years ago as the regime of neoliberal depolitization. It was installed with the idea, which is also very kind of common for any type of neoliberal regimes, of the pure management, where the ideology, the active political participation and so on doesn't matter. So the only thing is to manage the economy, to delegate this right to some kind of professionals and live your own private life. And this dominance of the private life, this neoliberal depolitization, lead more and more to the authoritarian political forms. And in fact, we can see how during this transition of the Putin's regime from some kind of neoliberal authoritarianism to the current situation, how it was faced with a kind of double movement, with a kind of the clash in between this tendency toward the depolitization and dominance of the private life, private sphere, and some social movements that they were trying to adapt the situation. Like, for example, in 2011, there was a huge movement against the authoritarian design of this regime, and even some 4 or 5 years ago, we also experienced a serious movement against corruption, and in fact against social inequality, huge social inequality, which is still the main element of the Russian society. So, as I said before, all these attempts of the building the opposition from below were confronted by the more and more repressive answers from the top. So you can say that even a year ago, before the war was started, the most organized opposition in Russia was already destroyed. Like, for example, Alexei Navalny was jailed in early 2021. His organization was labeled as the extremist and prohibited. You have already hundreds of political prisoners in Russia, and I think this number will grow. So there is no any way out for Putin than to intensify the repressions. But I believe that his regime is in crisis. This military operation, this war against Ukraine, it will fail, and it will definitely lead to some kind of the deep political and social changes in the Russian society.
I have a couple of final questions that I'd like to ask the three of you. One is that in the beginning of the interview, we talked about the renewed missile strikes on civilian targets. Periodically, Putin has threatened the use of nuclear weapons. And I'm wondering how each of you sees those threats. To what extent are those serious threats? To what extent is Putin playing poker with the rest of the world? And I'd like to start with you, Yuliya, on that question.
Yes, I will say that we should take Putin seriously, and it was proved from before. So exactly with the question about if the full-scale military invasion to Ukraine could be possible, and we know yes that it became a terrible reality. So I think that there is such a possibility. And of course, Putin is ready to play with this very dangerous rhetorics for years, even before this invasion. Like 2-3 years ago, he already mentioned this kind of threat from Russia to the West or whatever. So I think that there is such a possibility, but I think that there are also some limitations of this possibility, because the very let's say command coming from Putin to start this kind of nuclear strike will create some exact political risks for him. As we see for now, all the failures in Ukraine in the Russian media presented as a failures of the military authorities. So you have a all-time change of the leading military figures in the top of the Russian army. And of course, Putin himself, he is not responsible for the military failures. He is responsible only for the right strategic political decisions. So that situation could possibly provide some kind of tensions in between Putin and the military elite. And if this kind of command will come from Putin, to start a nuclear attack, that could be could create some opposition from the military, because of course the realization of this kind of command is totally dependent on the military leadership. And I believe that at least there you have maybe a little bit more responsible people than Vladimir Putin.
Thank you. Yuliya, on that same question.
Well, I agree with Ilya that when somebody threatens to throw nuclear bombs at you, you really need to pay attention and take it seriously. And we've also seen that Putin has made a lot of decisions, and and a lot of them were his near unilateral decisions. We know he's taken control over a lot of military command himself. That may seem contrary to some of the logical conclusions that we could arrive. So to that end, I think we need to take it seriously. Also, one thing that I think that tells me that we need to take these threats seriously is the fact that we have seen a normalization of nuclear strikes over years. And especially more recently in the public discourse in Russia, on Russian TV, in Russian parliament, in Russian papers. If about 10 plus years ago, it was only, and even 8.5 years ago, it was predominantly people like Vladimir Zhirinovsky talking about nuclear dust that we can turn everybody into. Then by this time last year, it was a normal chat to have on state TV programs about how it is possible to win nuclear war, and by the time United States are still collecting the rubble, Russia will already have been rebuilt. And look how great Hiroshima and Nagasaki look by now. That was a normal conversation on Russian state TV, and what that does is that gets viewers to, kind of used to the idea that this is not something shocking and scary and is a major taboo, and we need to be terrified of it. This is just becomes kind of entrenched as in normal part of warfare, and we need to take that extremely seriously. The kind of blame game that's being played inside the Russian state, especially against the Russian military command, and those who are going to be in charge of mobilization on the local level, for example, is something that is potentially rather destabilizing. And I agree with Ilya here that there may be resistance within those who will be involved and will be made later responsible to execute certain commands. But we certainly need to take this very seriously. I absolutely agree.
Alana, did you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think that in this danger of like nuclear attacks, we do not need to follow, the same path as many people who became now this passive social base for Putin's regime, did. And what I mean is that there is a part of Russian society which like actively believes that propaganda and supports Russian imperialism, but at the same time, there is, and we do not know exactly, okay, but there are Russian citizens who came to the point of such disbelief to propaganda, to any media, and to even like small forms of collectivity that they perceive like politics as something so far away from their everyday life, that this kind of position becomes the social base of the regime. And I think we should not, underestimate how much, even if they sound completely crazy, threats from Russian elites about nuclear attacks. At the same time, talking, more practically, if we're talking about tactical nuclear weapons, we do not need to forget that Russia keeps using forbidden weapons from the very first day of war, and Ukrainian army already saw phosphorus weapons, which are in their harm on the same level as tactical nuclear weapons. And we are already experiencing something very close to nuclear. So inside of Ukraine, people are not that scared because we already seen apocalypses like going on our, in our everyday life. But yes, I do even consider threats of strategic nuclear weapons as serious. I have water, power banks, and food stored at home for me and for my cat. And I have my personal nuclear protocol, as many other Ukrainians who consider this a serious issue. At the same time, they are ready even for this, because for them, safety of their country, of their people, is even more important than this fear of nuclear attack. And this is what also is just amazing, how people are really ready to resist even hearing those horrible threats.
If I can just jump right in just for one quick second, if you do not mind me.
No, go ahead.
I think one thing to add to what Alona was saying, and what I want to mention, because it really frustrates me, and it has for years. Well, not for years, but for a year now. A year ago, around this time, we were talking about distinction between a minor and a major incursion. That was the narrative coming from Washington and a couple of other Western centers. And how those may potentially lead to different sets of consequences for Russian Federation. By now, we're at a conversation that the red line to not cross is a nuclear strike. How did we get from the red line being a major incursion to a red line being a major strike? And some countries, and still there being conversations about and delays or protracted schedule, if you like, for air defense systems, for major weapons to Ukraine. And Ukrainians are still not so much as even allowed to shoot onto the territory of Russia, even though they're being threatened with nuclear strike. So I think there must be a serious conversation at international level of what kind of red lines actually do exist, how meaningful those are, because Putin will go further. If that line keeps being pushed, why would he take it seriously? I think the international leaders must actually start taking their own threats seriously. If you say that this is a red line and then you keep moving it, Putin will keep trotting over. And that is something that I think is also a big part of Putin getting bolder in this war.
So that's actually a good segue into my next to last question. And it's a question I want to ask Yuliya and Alona, specifically because in some segments of the peace movement in the West, and I've seen this in the United States very directly, There are those who have spoken against the Russian invasion, but they're opposed to weapons from the United States and NATO going to Ukraine. They basically make the argument there must be negotiations, and to the extent to which U.S. and NATO countries continue to supply weapons to Ukraine, it prolongs this and makes peace less and less feasible and might even provoke Putin into a nuclear strike. So how do you address that to the so-called peace movement in the West? How do you respond to that? Alona, start there.
Yeah, super short question. If you look at what Zelensky was saying for the last years, I'm saying years, not months. If you look at what Ukrainian diplomatic corpus was doing in the last years, it is clear that Ukraine was ready for diplomatic negotiations till the 24th of February. And still there were, even now, their attempts to, start this peaceful negotiation, which are being thrown away immediately by the Russian side. And if the situation is like this, the only way out of this war is complete military defeat of Russia with destruction of the regime. I think that Ukraine, whatever happens, still needs to try to go into peaceful negotiations, of course, on its terms of Ukrainian state being sovereign, in its territories of 1991. At the same time, this is now looks completely impossible. So the only realistic outcome of this war is, yes, military defeat of Russian regime. Unfortunately, I say it with a great pain.
Mm-hmm. Yuliya, same question.
Thank you. I agree with Ilona, and I want to also kind of make an appeal again to the red lines to an extent, if you like. The thing is that first of all, we need to start with understanding that this war started in 2014, that a lot of all of this time there have been negotiations, and I have a lot of problem with how those negotiations started to begin with, because they have sown the seeds for the current war. The fact that Russia was allowed to get away with annexing Crimea, and and the onus of that is on those who have negotiated the Minsk agreements, and it is on the United States, and it is on the UN, and it is on a lot of other international partners. If you allow countries to cross such red lines, and again, it was also not the first war that Russia has started. So if you allow those lines to be crossed, there will be more lines crossed. That is also very important to remember. Another thing here, because when there are always these kind of conversations about how, Ukraine is just simply not willing to negotiate. Why is the onus of, first of all, we're not talking about equally culpable parties to a conflict. Why is the onus to negotiate and concede on the victim? This is gaslighting. This is absolutely gaslighting. The victim because the victim was too provocative. Ukraine wanted too much sovereignty, wanted international law to be upheld. Russia recognized Ukraine in its 91 borders. Russia has signed the Budapest Memorandum as a guarantor of Ukraine's military security should Ukraine be attacked. When Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons mid-90s, and then Russia goes and attacks and invades Ukraine. What is Ukraine supposed to do? Russia has stepped over so many red lines. I do not understand why anybody is appealing to Ukraine to concede. Now it is clear that there is genocide being perpetrated in Ukraine, and yet Ukraine is still being asked to concede. Also, I want to ask those who are asking Ukraine to appease Putin, because a lot of it goes as to let's kind of do a bit of appeasement here, right? Again, there was a lot of that done, and look where we are now. Do those people have any idea of what has been happening before even February 24 in the territories occupied by Russia to ethnic minorities, to labor movement, the de-development, deindustrialization, the harassment, deindustrialization, hounding protesters, ethnic cleansing of Crimean Tatars, destruction of free press. That is, even before the recent invasion, that was the price of so-called ceasefire. Next, since the recent invasion started, and since every day we hear about mounting new evidence of torture, mass rape, kidnapping of children, harassment, you name it, it's there. That is what we are saying okay to when we're asking Ukraine to just stop shooting and put down the weapons. It is, again, an empirically uninformed, heartless, bourgeois luxury, pacifist argument. You cannot deny the victim of aggression the right to defend. If you're denying somebody the right to defend, your morality is out of the window, and I have nothing to say to you.
So that leads us to the final question, which, Alana, you actually began answering. And that is, what will it take for the war to end in a just peace? Alana, you basically said that the Russians have to be militarily defeated. And I wanted to ask Yuliya and Yuliya that same question. What will it take for the war to end in a just peace? So, Yuliya, I'll start with you, and then, Yuliya, you have the final word.
Thanks. I also want to add with what was already was said, that in fact, according to Putin's imperialist philosophy, Ukraine as such is not a kind of subject of any serious negotiations. Because Ukraine, according to the Russian leader, as most of the small nations, they are not subjects of international politics, but just the objects of someone else's interests. According to Putin's philosophy, there are just a few real sovereign powers in the world. Like US is definitely one of them, China is one of them, definitely Russia is one of them, but Ukraine, Baltic states, Poland, or even most of Europe, or even most of the Latin America, they are not just exist as the subjects of any talks with the true sovereigns. If the American peace movement want to have a world like this, where you will have 3-4 sovereigns which will divide the world according to their own needs. So that is the way how to build this world. And the way to build this world is to recognize the right of Putin to get what he want from Ukraine or from any other post-Soviet country, because he definitely will continue after he will get some piece of Ukraine. He will probably discover other Russian historical lands in Kazakhstan or in Moldavia or in the Baltic states. And of course, his main interest is to have such a dialogue, such a negotiations with the true sovereign as the United States. So in this sense, of course, he need Donald Trump to be American leader to have a honest and open partner for such a deal. So, do you want to have this world Do you want to have such a leadership in your country? Do you want to have such a philosophy behind the American political elite? So that are the questions that are raised by Putin's leadership. Is not just a question of some problems, some territorial problems with Ukraine that should be a subject of negotiations between the Putin and Zelensky. The challenge to the world is much more serious, and it is more serious also because it is very much related to the whole, let's say philosophy, all the way of seeing the world. Which is not just limited to some unique Russian imperialist nationalism. You can find absolutely the same type of rhetorics as Putin's among the Western European far right, or in the Fox News, for example, which I follow regularly. So there you have the nearly the same type of approach than you have in the Putin's Russia, and the only difference between them is that Putin already installed this kind of regime in Russia, and these people like Trump or like Marine Le Pen, they're just on the way to it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Yuliya. Final word.
Thank you. Again, I second Ilya here, because we have seen how many lines and how many wars Putin's regime has started, and they will not stop in Ukraine. And indeed, we need to remember how many ethnic Russians or Russian citizens have fled the country for fleeing the war, fleeing sanctions, and that also creates a pretext for Putin to start invading right, left, and center. But also, of course, he has his 4 historic narratives for invading further. But how did this war should end, and what would make it kind of a fair thing to an extent? First of all, Putin has to be defeated, and he has to be defeated militarily. He only understands might. He does not understand negotiations. We have seen that already, and he actually laughs all his way to the bank. In the face of politicians at the UN and elsewhere, to say that to show them up that they're toothless. So Putin needs to be defeated militarily. Ukraine needs to return to its 1991 borders. There needs to be an international tribunal established for war crimes and crimes of genocide. There needs to be reparations being paid at expense of state and oligarchs from Russia to reconstruct Ukraine. That absolutely needs to happen. And there needs to be an international there need to be also, alongside the war crime tribunals, there need to be processes established for transitional justice, because this is not something that will happen overnight, and it will be a lengthy process. On international level, there needs to be a reform of UN and the international security architecture. We have seen how toothless the UN are. They have failed repeatedly, and again, the war, this current invasion by Russia into Ukraine is not the first war that UN have prevented from properly from stopping, from escalating. So there needs to be disbanding of the Permanent Security Council. There should be horizontalization of decision making. We have seen how the whole of the United Nations mechanism have been held hostage by 5 nations with the right of veto, and it's been a parade of the powerful. Until we have an international functioning security system, until there is trust in international legislation that equally applies to everybody, to every country, and that sovereignty of each state is sacrosanct, we will never have a stable international security order. So that will have to happen. And for the final bit of justice, what needs to happen is what also cripples the sovereignty of different nations is the economic unevenness that exists. Needs to be addressed, and that we have seen that around the energy politics and around food crisis. that have also kind of interfered with certain voting procedures at the UN. So that will need to be sorted alongside with cancellation of debt for the low-income countries that they have not been responsible for accruing, but that have been crippling their economic development and survival of their populations. Without that, international justice and fairness in international system will not be restored. So there is a lot to fight for. And let's hope that we will live to see that justice happen. And that, again, is not just about Ukraine. It's about every other country who has been done unfairly by international system.
Indeed. Well, I want to thank the three of you. I want to thank Yuliya Yurchenko, Alana Lacheva, Ilya Budratskis for speaking with us about the Russo-Ukrainian War, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, the threat to peace, the threat to justice that's been presented by this war. I want to thank you, the listeners, for taking the time to explore with us what is actually going on, to getting deeper beyond the mainstream media coverage and getting beyond the Russian trolls, to be blunt, and the nonsense that many of people have been hearing that has sowed a lot of confusion about what is going on. And hopefully the interview that we just conducted will help in answering a number of questions and hopefully also provoking your interest to explore this more deeply, but also to take a stand on the side of peace and justice and self-determination. I'm Bill Fletcher. Thank you on behalf of the Real News Network. Take care.